They found the horse before they found the man. It came at dusk, moving like a shadow across the last light. A bay mare with a white blaze down her face, one stirrup empty and swinging against her flank. Her sides were slick with sweat, her legs caked with mud. But the thing that made the men stop and the women cross themselves was the blood. Dark and soaking through the leather of the saddle, and the way she walked, as if she carried a weight no saddle could bear. In the town of Mercy's Hollow, the bell in the small white church had already begun its evening peal. The mountains behind them swallowed the dying day. The town, 3 false front stores, a saloon that smelled of whiskey and sawdust, and a row of cabins, turned toward that horse like a congregation. They called her Boone, for the man who rode her, though some swore he was not the kind of man to be named after legends. His name was Thomas Hale. He had come to Mercy's Hollow as most men did, weary, half-broke, and full of some regret you couldn't name. He rode with a slow steadiness, spoke in a voice like gravel washed smooth, and always tipped his hat. Folks whispered about him. Once a ranch hand, once a drifter, once a son. Now a keeper of small kindnesses. But he had a secret no one in Mercy's Hollow knew, and that secret was the shape of his solitude. The first to meet the mare was Ruby Finch, the blacksmith's wife. She knelt and put her palm on the mare's neck, as if the horse could tell her more than the tracks in the dust. "Where's Thomas?" she asked the animal aloud, like a prayer. The mare just snorted and shook her head, a flared, desperate movement. And there, on the ground near the mare's hooves, lay Thomas's battered hat, its brim curled, a white feather pinned to the side. The band was dark with blood. Sheriff Langley came then, boots scuffing, badge dull in the last light. He knelt, touched the saddle, and frowned. The stirrup leather was split. There were drag marks, faint, leading toward the shadow of the canyon road. He called for lanterns and for men who could ride hard into the night. The townsfolk gathered at the edge of the street. The saloon doors creaked. A piano stopped mid-song, as if the tune itself was afraid to go on. Thomas was the kind of man who kept his grief wrapped in silence, but the town had seen him on frosty mornings standing at the edge of the cemetery, talking to a headstone as if words could build a bridge. He'd never married. He kept a small cabin near the creek where a wind chime of tin and glass sang in the breeze, and where a single photograph was tucked behind a frame. A woman with hair like dusk, and a boy with an untamed grin. When the mare returned alone, Ruby remembered those mornings and let out a sound that was half a sob. They found the tracks, horse prints, a scuffle where a second set had veered off the road, and a smear of blood that went toward the mountain pass. Sheriff Langley ordered 2 men to ride with him. Thomas's neighbor, old Hank Merriweather, saddled his sorrel without a second thought. The 3 of them followed the trail as the sky went black and the stars came up one by one, like watchful witnesses. As they rode, the town watched them go until their lanterns were just little flames smoking in the dark. Inside the chapel, the wooden pews were full of unspoken prayers. Mercy, S. Hollow, had a way of gathering grief so that it became almost a thing you could hold, heavy and familiar. The widow at the mercantile, Mary Ellis, clung to a photograph of her own boy and whispered, "Lord, bring him back." They had all known Thomas in the way small towns know one another. They knew his quiet ways, his mending of offense, his reluctance to speak of the past. They just didn't know why the mountains had turned their faces away from him. The ride to the canyon was a cold thing. The wind came whipped and sharp. The scent of pine and old snow lay in the hollows. Tracks wound tighter together, then spread apart as if something larger had stumbled. Then, boot marks, a man on foot, and a smear where he had fallen. A scrap of cloth caught on a thorn bush, its edge ragged and soaked with dark. Sheriff Langley held it to the lantern. "Hell," he said, the word tumbling dry. Hank just spit into the wind. They found more blood, darker now, a smear on a rock that told of something being dragged. They followed it up the ravine, climbing past brittle scrub and boulders, The mountain closed in as if it were a great animal curling up to sleep. Paths vanished. The echo took your voice and kept it. The air grew thinner and a strange hush fell. No crickets, no owl. It was the sort of silence that made a man listen to the sound of his own heart like a drum. And then they heard it. A single, low moan, carried on the air. They pressed forward and found, at the mouth of a narrow cleft, an overturned wagon wheel half buried in snow and a rope that had been cut. Near it, a handprint in the pale earth, small and frantic. No man, no body. And then, as Hank stepped closer, the ground underfoot slumped and revealed a hastily dug, shallow hole. In it, a crumpled coat, and beneath that, something that made the lanterns draw closer, as if the light itself sought to know. It was a child's shoe, tiny and cracked, half buried in dirt. The world narrowed to that shoe. Sheriff Langley tightened his jaw until the lines near his mouth looked like the canyon's own rifts. Back in town, Ruby's knees had given out when the shoe was shown to her. The wind dropped, as if the mountains were holding their breath. No one could yet speak the thing that rose like a sickness in their chests. If Thomas had gone away with Boone alone, why was a child's shoe here? Hank's face, a map of weathered stone for years, now showed confusion, and then something darker. The suspicion that this was no reckless bandit raid, but a choice, and a desperate one. Sheriff Langley stared up the jagged mouth of the ravine and said, "We find him, or we bury him. Whatever comes. Ride careful." They moved on, lanterns swaying, their small shine against the black. A raven cried somewhere above, and then the mountains were silent again. So quiet it felt like a wound. The trail stopped at a narrow ledge. There, caught on a jagged outcrop, was Thomas's hat. The feather was gone. Underneath, the ledge was disturbed, tracks leading away into a darkness that made the lantern light die. Hank put his hand on the brim and felt the warm smear of blood. He looked up, as if the mountains themselves might answer. Then, from somewhere deeper within that black, came a sound like a man calling. Or perhaps the wind. Or something between them. It was half a plea and half a challenge. They rode toward it, 3 figures against a sky as black as spilled ink. Boone's mare fretting behind them like a ghost. Sheriff Langley raised his lantern high. Hank's rifle was ready. The wind pushed at them like the hand of a judge. For a moment, there was no other sound but the crunch of their boots and the thud of horse hooves. And then, sudden and unmistakable, a single shot cracked the night. The lanterns trembled. The horses reared. And in Mercy's Hollow, a woman on the porch of the Mercantile heard the sound and let out a gasp that was the beginning of a prayer. No one slept that night. The horse had come back bleeding, carrying a promise but leaving behind a question that tasted like ash. Somewhere in the dark, Thomas Hale was either a man alive and in need, or a man who had come to the edge of the world's mercy. The mountain had a secret, and the town held its breath as the echoes died, leaving only the cold and the sudden, terrible silence. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the heart of the Old West. Dawn came slow and uncertain, like it wasn't sure Mercy's Hollow deserved the light. Frost painted every rooftop silver, and the church bell hadn't yet rung when the 3 riders returned. They weren't triumphant, not defeated, but they carried a weight heavier than a body. Sheriff Langley's face was tight, his jaw clenched like he'd spent the night biting through grief. Hank rode hollow-eyed, his boots muddy from ravine dirt, rifle still resting across his saddle, and Boone's mare, trembling, walked behind them, riderless, again. They had not found Thomas Hale. Not his voice, not his body, only that single gunshot that had echoed through the ravine, followed by a silence so thick it felt like earth closing over a coffin. Mary Ellis stood outside the Mercantile, hands wrapped in her shawl despite the morning calm. When the riders came into view, she searched their faces like a mother searching a battlefield. Ruby Finch stood beside her, one hand pressed tight over her heart. Sheriff Langley swung down from his horse. "We didn't find him," he said, his voice low and heavy. "But we found signs. Ruby's breath shook. Blood? The sheriff nodded just once. Mary whispered, "Dear Lord." Hank dismounted slower, his boots hitting the ground with a thud that had nothing to do with age. Tracks led to the high ridge, then rope marks, and his voice, a sound that hadn't wavered in years, finally cracked. A little one's shoe, buried, shallow, fresh. Gasps rippled through the small crowd that had gathered. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. A child. Out there, people began to murmur, a cold fear crawling up their spines like ice. Who was the child? Why was Thomas with them? Was he their protector or their fugitive? Mary's hand tightened in her shawl. Thomas. He wouldn't harm a child. Ruby whispered in agreement. No, he couldn't. Not with the gentleness in that man's hands. Sheriff Langley rubbed his temples, the exhaustion clear on his face. I pray you're right. But in the cold morning air, prayers felt thin and fragile. By noon, the search party had doubled. Miners, ranchers, even the men from the saloon came forward, armed and ready. Mercy's hollow might judge you for your sins, but it didn't leave a man or a child to die in the cold. But the mayor, well, he was a different creature entirely. Elijah Pike, thin-eyed and slick-voiced, a man who never earned trust, only rented it with intimidation. He stepped out of his office, his velvet coat far too fine for the frontier dust. "Sheriff," Pike called out, his voice slicing through the tense quiet. "Let me ask the question everyone's afraid to. What if Hale ran? What if he stole that child?" The voices stilled. It was a dangerous accusation, a seed of doubt planted in fertile ground. Langley squared up, his spine going iron straight. Thomas Hale is not a kidnapper. Pike just lifted a brow. Then why a child's shoe in the wilderness? Why blood on his horse? Where is the child? And where is he? The crowd shifted, unease rising like smoke from a dying fire. That man has secrets, Pike pressed, his voice dripping with insinuation. He came here alone, never explains his past, never says where he's from. What if— Enough, Mary Ellis snapped, her voice sharp, surprising even herself. Thomas Hale has stood graveside at dawn, fixing fences that weren't his, feeding children that weren't his. He's carried more quiet pain than cowards like you ever could. Pike's nostrils flared in anger. Pain don't make a man innocent. Hank stepped forward then, his presence solid and unwavering. But doing right when no one sees does, and Thomas Hale has done right. Pike backed off, not from fear, but from knowing the town wasn't on his side this morning. Not yet. Meanwhile, high up in those mountains, the wind carved through the pines like blades through linen. Snow flurried and ravens perched as if waiting for judgment. And in a narrow ravine, beneath a ledge the search party hadn't yet reached, Thomas Hale stirred. He lay half buried in pine needles and frozen mud, a blood-soaked bandage wrapped tight around his ribs, torn from his own shirt. His left arm shook violently as the cold burrowed deep into his bones. Snowflakes melted against his fevered face. Beside him, a child, a little girl, 7 at most, curled beneath his coat. Her cheeks were flushed with cold, her breath thin but steady. Dirt streaked her face and her shoes were mismatched. One was missing. "Charlotte," Thomas whispered, his voice raw and broken. "Stay warm, little one. Stay with me." He held her close, shielding her from the biting wind with his own back. His blood had soaked into her tattered dress, but she slept on, trusting him with a faith he felt he had no right to carry. Thomas looked toward the ridge above. The rope burn on his wrist stung, and the memory of what happened hit him in jagged flashes. Gunmen, rough voices, a stagecoach ambush, a mother's desperate scream as the girl was ripped from her trembling arms. Thomas wasn't even supposed to be there. He had only happened upon the scene while riding to town. But he intervened. He was too late to save the mother, but not too late to carry the child away. Just not far enough. He had fought. He had lost his footing and gone over the ridge trying to shield the girl from the fall. pain seared his ribs. Broken, he was sure. His revolver was lost in the tumble. But he had crawled with the child in his arms, deeper into cover. He had hidden her, shielded her, and he'd shot one of the men when they came searching. That was the shot the town had heard. He closed his eyes as the world swayed around him. He spoke, his voice a hoarse mix of a prayer and a promise, whispered against her hair. "Your mama died, trust in me to deliver you safe. I don't break promises." He coughed, and the taste of blood was on his lips. The pain in his side was like fire. In the distance, he heard it. Faint hoofbeats. Thomas tensed. Were they saviors, or were they the men hunting the girl? He listened. One set of hoofbeats, two, then three. A group. Slow, searching, deliberate. And then he heard voices, faint through the wind. Spread out. They couldn't have gone far. It wasn't the sheriff. It was the outlaws. Thomas gently shook the girl. "Charlotte, you gotta wake up, sweetheart. Quiet now." Her eyes blinked open, cloudy with exhaustion. "Mama!" His heart cracked. "Not Mama, darling, but I'm right here." Her little fingers clutched his torn coat. Thomas gritted his teeth, pushing himself up on shaking arms as the snow bit into his palms. He lifted the child, biting back a groan of agony, and tucked her deeper under his coat. He whispered, every word forged in iron, "They ain't taking you, not while I breathe." Bootsteps crunched on the ridge above them. A voice called out, cruel and close, "Spread the ravine. Hale's bleedin'. He's ours, and the girl pays double." Thomas held the child tight. The wolves were waiting. The mountains were silent. And back in Mercy's Hollow, the town was praying. With his own blood running into the snow, Thomas Hale gathered what little strength he had left. He prepared to stand, prepared to fight, prepared to keep a promise, even if it cost him his last breath. The wind held its breath, and the outlaws began to descend toward him. The snow whispered as it fell from the ledge. In the pale light, a dark figure slid down the ravine wall, boots scraping against stone. His breath plumed in the biting cold, a revolver gleaming in his fist. Above him, a second shadow crouched, rifle sweeping the ridge. A third voice, sharp and cutting, sliced through the wind from even higher up. "Check every crease. Hale's down there, bleeding or dead." Hidden in the hollow between a fallen pine and a wall of rock, Thomas Hale pressed a trembling hand to the small child's back. Little Charlotte's breath shivered, a warm spot against his chest. With every inhale, a sharp pain stabbed through his ribs, broken, maybe two of them. But it wasn't the pain that had him in its grip, it was duty. He looked down at her face, smudged with dirt, tears dried like salt on her cheeks. Her small fingers twisted in the fabric of his coat. A memory flickered through his mind, another child, a boy with hair like sunlight, running across a field, his shoes slapping dust. A promise he'd broken, swallowed by a world too cruel. He prayed, "Not again, Lord, not this one." Thomas tightened his grip on a fallen pistol. It had belonged to the man he'd shot last night. He steadied his shaking hand. "Stay behind me," he whispered, his voice a low rumble. Charlotte's reply was a frail quiver. I'm scared." He brushed her hair back gently, his voice softening to gravel. "I know, darlin', but you're not alone." Up above, the first outlaw spotted a faint smear of blood against the white snow, and a cruel grin spread across his face. "There you are." He raised his gun, but Thomas fired first. The shot boomed, its echo rolling down the ravine like a clap of thunder. The outlaw jerked, stumbled, and fell lifeless into the frost. A sharp, brittle silence followed. Then, a shout. "He's alive! Get him!" Snow exploded as two more men scrambled down the ravine. Bullets cracked against the rock, sending shards of stone stinging against Thomas's cheek. He dragged Charlotte deeper behind the tree, wincing as pain sliced through his side. A voice barked from above. "Bring me the girl. Hale's a dead man anyway." Charlotte whimpered. Thomas's jaw clenched so hard a muscle jumped near his ear. He leaned close, his whisper like a vow carved in oak. "Cover your ears. Don't look till I say." His breath hitched. He fired again. Missed. His vision was swimming, his hand shaking uncontrollably. Another shot came from the outlaws. Bark burst just inches from his skull. The second outlaw was closing in fast, a sneer twisting his face. Before the man could aim, Thomas slammed his shoulder into him and they both tumbled into the snow and brush. The world exploded in a flurry of white. Fists, boots, blinding pain. The outlaw's hand closed around Thomas's throat. Spots flooded his eyes. "You should have stayed out of it," the man hissed. Fighting for air, Thomas rasped, "I promised her mother." With a last surge of strength, driven by grief, by love, by something holy, Thomas grabbed a jagged rock and struck. The outlaw fell still. Above, the final outlaw roared in fury and fired blindly. The bullet tore through Thomas's coat, grazing his shoulder. He bit down a cry of pain. Charlotte sobbed softly, her cries muffled. Suddenly, a new voice echoed down the mountain. "Thomas!" Lantern light bobbed along the ridge. It was Sheriff Langley. Hank, and half the men of Mercy's Hollow pouring over the ridge like Judgment Day. Gunfire cracked from above, answered by return fire. The last outlaw spun, shot, and tumbled lifelessly into the snow. And then, all at once, the mountain fell silent again. But this time, the silence wasn't filled with dread. It was filled with relief. Boots crashed through the brush. Sheriff Langley slid into view, rifle up, his breath steaming. He saw Thomas, bloody, kneeling, one arm protectively wrapped around the child, and his face broke open with something raw and fragile. Thomas. Thomas sagged, his strength finally leaving him. Charlotte clung to his coat, crying, "He saved me. He didn't let him take me." Langley knelt, his hand steadying Thomas's shoulder. "Easy. It's over. You held on, son." Thomas looked past him, his eyes searching. Did I keep my word? Did I? Hank crouched beside them, his voice thick as winter wool. "You did, boy. You did righteous." Charlotte's tiny hand cupped Thomas's cheek. Her voice, small and trembling, said, "Mama said angels would find me." Thomas's eyes glimmered. Maybe it's just men trying their best. He swayed and Hank caught him. "Stay with us." Thomas's breath faltered, slow. "I didn't save my own boy once." Langley shook his head sharply. "Don't do that. This ain't some punishment. This is redemption." Snow drifted quietly between them like heaven holding its breath. Charlotte leaned in and pressed her forehead to Thomas's. "You're my hero." The words hit him like a sunrise. The tightness in his chest eased, softened. Tears traced clean paths through the dirt on his cheek, and Thomas Hale, who had carried grief like a second skin, whispered to the girl, "Live brave, sweetheart." His eyes fluttered, exhausted. Langley lifted him gently. "We're taking you home, both of you." Days later, Mercy's Hollow gathered. The church bells rang, clear in the cold air, not for sorrow, but for thanksgiving. Thomas lay bandaged in the church, weak but smiling, as the town's women fussed over him. Charlotte slept safe in Mary Ellis's arms, with new shoes on her feet and a ribbon in her hair. Sheriff Langley stood beside Thomas's bed, his voice gruff. "The town decided something. That cabin of yours by the creek. It's too quiet, and that little girl's gonna need a home." Thomas blinked slowly. "You asking me to—" Hank chuckled. "We're telling you, son. She chose you." As if on cue, Charlotte stirred in her sleep and reached for Thomas's hand. His rough palm closed around hers, like it had always belonged there. A life lost once. A life saved now. He swallowed hard. "I'll raise her honest." kind. Langley smiled. That's all the Lord or child ever asked. That winter, anyone walking past the cabin by the creek heard laughter, one small and bright, mingling with a deeper, slower chuckle. A wind chime sang softly in the breeze. On a small table, a photograph of a smiling boy gained a new companion, another child's face, smiling, warm beside it. Sometimes at dawn, Thomas still rode his horse, Boone, through the valley, the mountains quiet and watchful. But he no longer rode alone in his grief. He rode with purpose. And at night, when the fire burned low, a little girl curled safe beside him would whisper, "You kept your promise." And the mountains, those silent judges, seemed to bow in peace. Because in the wild, unforgiving West, a man with nothing left had chosen love over vengeance. And in doing so, he found life again. Mercy as Hollow would forever remember the day a bleeding horse returned without its rider, but the rider returned with a child and a heart made whole. Thank you so much for watching. If this story touched your heart, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more tales of courage and redemption. We'll see you in the next one.